All right, so we should have Stuart Hardwick here. I saw you pop in. Stuart is one of Mike's writer kids. And Stuart, I know through Writers of the Future, and I have said of Stuart something that is the highest compliment I will pay to any writer in regards to his story, Gift of the Rocket Man. That. Stuart, are you going to need to share screen or are you just going to talk?
Share a screen, yes.
All right. Let me. All right. I think you should be able to share screen now. If not.
Yep.
All right.
I just got to get it to the right window. I guess that's it. There we go. All right. So thank you all for coming this morning. It means a lot to all of us. As you can tell from Martin, Mike meant a lot to all of us personally as well as in terms of a career. Who am I? Let me see if this will work. There we go. There's going to be some lag. All right. So who am I? As Martin said, I'm a Writers of the Future winner. I met Mike Resnick through Writers of the Future. I'm also a regular in Analog Magazine. I write science fiction and fantasy. I have said of Writers of the Future that it was like getting to the end of the yellow brick road and meeting the wizard. And instead of being told, ignore the man behind the screen, having basically Mike reach out a hand and say, here, let me help you out. It has been a wonderful experience ever since then. And I really feel for writers who don't have that. After I won Writers of the Future, I went to my first Worldcon, and it's no secret that writers tend to be introverts, right? So I go to this big convention and there's all these people, and people run up to me and they know me from Writers of the Future and from Facebook and from all the other people that I know. So it's been a great community. And Martin, thank you. This is a great opportunity to start paying back and paying forward. So let me start by saying all writer advice is wrong. What I mean by that is a lot of it is contradictory. You have to determine what kind of writer you're trying to be, what kind of career you're trying to have in order to know which advice applies to you and which advice doesn't. An obvious example is if you're doing technical writing, you're not going to use, the same style as if you're doing fiction. But also in terms of business, in terms of the actual career, there are different paths. You can self-publish, you can go the traditional route. Most times today, people do some kind of combination of those two things. So you have to know what kind of career you're going to have in order to know what advice applies to you. A lot of it is contradictory, and that's just the way it is. Also, a lot of the writer advice you get is an oversimplification. A perfect example is you'll hear a lot, show, don't tell, which is a memorable way to teach beginning writers not to rely too heavily on narrative summary, right? It makes sense if you think about it. If you pay attention when you're reading things that you enjoy yourself. The trouble is, if you always show, don't tell, you're going to write very verbose prose. So don't take things to extremes. Another example is begin in media res, which means write all the, what I call clearing of the baffles at the beginning of a project where the writer is exploring the world and figuring out how things are going to start. And it's not necessarily really part of the story that you really want to tell. And you need to skip ahead to really the inciting incident or where the story for your main character starts. But a lot of beginning writers misinterpret that as meaning I need to start in the middle of a battle. No, nobody wants to see your battle until they know what the stakes are, right? So don't take things too literally. And, avoid adverbs, avoid passive voice. these are oversimplified rules. So another one that gets misinterpreted a lot is kill your darlings, which I believe was intended originally to mean advice to be somewhat cutthroat when you're revising your own work, and cut out the perhaps somewhat purple prose that you really enjoyed writing and keep the prose that really needs to be there. But that's, again, been misinterpreted. Like a game of telephone, it gets passed down from person to person to person. And then you have people believing that we all need to be George R.R. Martin and kill our main character. That's not what that means. And then a lot of writing advice is just wrong. Like you shouldn't end a sentence with a preposition. Yeah, you can do that. That was never a rule. Just don't do it in a way that's confusing. But I'm not going to talk a whole lot today about those types of rules. I'm going to talk about advice for the career that I got, sitting up at the bar at Writers of the Future with Mike, talking to Eric Flynn at Writers of the Future and other conferences, and all the different people that I've had the privilege to get to sit with, who are those wizards pulling me up by the hand. So David Gerrold's writing advice: do something else, anything else. Writing is a soul-crushing experience for a lot of people. There's a reason that we have the stereotype of, the writer alcoholic sitting over the typewriter with a cigarette. We have the expression, writing is the act of sitting at the typewriter until blood comes out, or something like that. It can be really hard. You have to have a lot of fortitude. It's not something to be entered into lightly. The best career advice, honestly, is do something else. There's a good chance you'll make more money in a minimum wage job. But as David says, if me saying that only pisses you off, because there are stories inside you burning to get out and you want to get them out into the world, and you know that if you haven't done that by the time you die, there are worlds and characters that die with you, well then, God help you, you're a writer. Welcome. So you need to manage your career. You are not going to be the next Tolkien, the next George R.R. Martin, the next J.K. Rowling, and neither would they if they were starting today. It just doesn't work that way. I was at a writer's workshop where George R.R. Martin came, and he was asked to give career advice, and he said, I can tell you everything you need to know about becoming a professional writer in 1976. Not very helpful. Every writer has a unique path. But here's the thing a lot of beginning writers don't realize. Every failure, every setback, every barrier along the way is like a chunk of stone falling from the mountain. And every chunk of stone becomes a step. And together they build a staircase to the summit. All you have to do is avoid getting hit in the head and keep climbing the stairs, and you'll get there. Your writing career is a journey, not a race. I know I was as guilty as anyone when I started out. I wanted quick results. I had no idea what was good and what was bad, except for my own personal opinion. I didn't know how the business worked. I was going to go out and I was going to set the world on fire. And you could. It's possible. People do it. Don't bank on that. But if you keep walking down the path, taking logical steps, you will get there. And I did mention before, all writing advice is contradictory. Well, on the other hand, you're going to die. Don't spend your entire life preparing for the career. Start your career today. And hopefully the rest of the advice as I go through is going to help you do that. Make it the journey, forget the race. Okay. I'm getting ahead of my slides. That's okay. Okay, so where do we start in this journey? Well, obviously, as the old adage from the Bible, probably before that, control what you can, accept what you can't, and just keep moving forward, right? This is a nice diagram. I think I got this from Dave Wolverton. I don't know who thought it up originally, but it's a wonderful way of showing that your career is a combination of things that you control and things you don't control. It helps a lot to be lucky. J.K. Rowling sent Harry Potter to every publisher on the planet, and the last one to look at it, Scholastic, bought it. And if they hadn't, she would not be a household name today, very likely. Everybody, no matter how good you are, no matter how bad you are, luck plays an important part in your career. You can be upset about that, or you can accept it and work with it. Then the second in the triad is capability, talent, if you will. But it's more than just talent. I mean, what makes one writer talented and another talented? That's a matter of taste, right? Which gets back to luck. But also capability has to do with productivity, how well you study your craft and get the most out of the talent that you have. So you have some control, but not complete control. And then the third in the triad is professionalism, which you have complete control over. Nobody wants to work with somebody who's a complainer, who doesn't turn their work in on time, who feels entitled. You know the type. You work with them. You don't want to work with them. Don't be that person. Don't go to conferences, as we were told at Writers of the Future, as no one should have to be told, and not bathe before you go meet people that you're building a career with. Be reliable, be on time, be professional, be courteous, be considerate of other people's political opinions, whether you agree with them or not, because demonizing them will not help you change them. Now, if you can master all three of these things, you've got it made. If you're a professional who produces a lot of good work and you're lucky, you can be the next George R.R. Martin. Some of this you can control, some of it you can't. And I see a lot of writers wasting a lot of time moaning about the things they have no control over. Put it aside, move on. Focus on the things you can control. You can make yourself a better writer. You can develop your craft. You can develop what talents you have. You can be professional, and you can improve your luck, as we'll come back to. So how do we do this? How do we improve our luck? How do we make the most of our talents? How do we avoid amateurish mistakes? First, study your craft. This does not mean you need an MFA. In fact, there are some who question whether that might actually be counterproductive. I would leave that as an exercise for you to decide for yourself. But it does mean you should respect your audience enough to know what you're doing. When I started writing professionally, I went back to school at the graduate level and got a graduate certificate because I did not feel that the mastery of the basics that I had gotten from public school was up to snuff. And I have never regretted that. I was lucky I was in a position that I could do it. Studying your craft definitely means that you need to plan to have written, had critiqued, and revised 1 million words before you can expect to write at a professional level. Your mileage may vary, obviously. This gets tossed around with different numbers. I found it to be a fairly reasonable heuristic. You're just not going to quit your job one day and start writing and be at a professional level. Having said that, obviously it depends on where you're starting out from. You do need to know correct grammar, spelling, punctuation, usage, that sort of thing. But you're not necessarily always going to follow the rules by the book. That's okay. You have to know the rules in order to know where it's okay to violate them. And I'm going to resist the urge to correct spelling errors in my notes as I go through this. Read widely, especially outside your genre and even your time. And my advice is read the very best authors you can. There are those who say you should read terrible authors so you can see what they did wrong. I disagree with that. There is perhaps a place for reading schlock the way you watch an old B movie in order to pick it apart and analyze the flaws. But I would be wary of that because we tend to learn by emulation, and you want to emulate the very best. Workshops, events like this, writers groups are invaluable, not only for learning the craft, but for learning the business. You need to learn to read contracts. It would not be a bad idea to go to your local community college or college and take a course in personal law. You're not going to turn into a lawyer, but you need to know the basics of how contracts work and how agreements are formed so that you're not completely reliant on an agent or a lawyer for handling these things. And I say that I perhaps shouldn't have led off with that. I don't want to make it sound like you need to go out and become a legal expert, but there are lots of scams that target writers, and some of them are by legitimate businesses. And the better you can protect yourself, the better you'll be protected. If you don't know about reversion of rights, learn about it. It's important. It's one of the most important details in contract law that affects writers. Most beginning writers worry about copyright. You don't really need to worry about that. This is a small business. Nobody you want to do business with is going to steal your intellectual property. And most people you do business with, they have mechanisms in place to handle that kind of stuff. You can do what you want. It used to be advised that you like take manuscripts and mail them to yourself to have proof that you had them. That's all dubious value. There are easier ways to do that kind of thing these days. The main thing is do business with reputable people and they will take care of you. But be aware that even reputable people have legal departments. So read those contracts and understand reversion of rights. Having said that, don't spend 20 years becoming a lawyer if you want to write. You need to get out there and say it with me, write, 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 right?
Right.
Doing research right. Research, as you may already know, is an endless rabbit hole of time wastage, but it's also necessary. A big mistake that beginning writers make, and indeed that many people in industry make, is thinking that what they have learned about the world from media is all they need to know. No. If you write about, let's just say, military combat from the war movies you watched growing up, that's like playing telephone tag. Some of the reality gets lost every step along the way. I'll give you a perfect example. I was talking with my wife earlier. If you like science fiction, you're familiar with the movie Apollo 13, and you may very well think of Apollo 13 as one of the most realistic movies of its type that's ever been made, and it is. It's certainly the only space movie I've ever heard of where they got in an airplane with the actors in order to realistically portray zero G. But there are huge technical errors in Apollo 13. There are large groups of people who were condensed into one person, sequences of events that were changed around, just issues of facts that are wrong. And that's okay, because all those changes had to be made in order to condense something that happened over several days into 2 hours and make it dramatic and still make it accurate enough to do justice to the people who put their lives on the line. It's a masterwork of that kind of narrative, almost documentary storytelling. And it could only have been done because of the involvement of real experts on the subject matter. And that's what you need to strive to do when you're doing your own research. Research is not reading Tolkien and then trying to reproduce Tolkien. Tolkien would be a failure if he were writing today, because we already have Tolkien. We don't need another. You might disagree with that, but go back to primary resources or go to experts to find out how things work, how things should work in the world you're trying to creating, the technology you're trying to creating, the legal wrangling you're trying to create, whatever it is. Don't play telephone tag with plot lines. Don't derive your story from secondhand, thirdhand sources. And Martin, I can't see my clock while I'm doing this, so kind of give me a note when I get to 30 minutes.
Surprisingly, for the amount of content you've given, you're at 18 so far.
Okay, we're doing good. Research. Okay, so seek honest feedback, which means not from your family, not from your mother, definitely not from your wife or dog or anyone who cares about you or you really hold dear, because they will lie. Of course they're going to lie. You will lie too. It's really hard to look somebody in the face and say, this is crap. You need to throw away the first 3 chapters that you spent 2 months on. And I have been at the receiving end of critique exactly like that. And I was delighted to have it because it was correct. One of the hardest things to learn as a beginning writer is to model the minds of your readers, because your readers are not you. They don't see the world the way you do. They don't read for the same reasons you do necessarily, and they don't know the things that you do. Critique from, ideally from writers, because they know what they're looking for, but also from dedicated readers, is invaluable in helping you to see where your readers are going to trip over your language, where they're going to be confused by things, and just generally how your writing comes across. You cannot do that yourself. I don't care how gifted or talented, brilliant or genius you are, you will not know how other people read your work until they read your work and they tell you. Which leads me to one of those little quirky pieces of writing advice. If 3 readers tell you there's a problem in the same place in your manuscript, there is a problem in that place in your manuscript. It's almost certainly not the problem that any of them said, because they don't know what you were trying to achieve there. But there is a problem. And even if 2 of the 3 are assholes and said it in a really obnoxious way, ignore that. They still told you that something was wrong. Be grateful and go find it. It can make a difference between getting published and not. Aristotle said there is only one way to avoid criticism: do nothing, say nothing, and be nothing. I'll share a little story from my life. My sister was going to be an artist, and she went to college, and she went through a couple of years of college, and she got to the point where she had to do art for critique, which I guess they should have done earlier in the program, because she could not take it. And she ended up dropping out and going to a different college and going into a whole different career. If you can't take criticism, you do not need to be an artist of any kind. That's just a reality you need to accept right now, because you're never going to improve. You're going to be one of these people who's always defending what you're producing instead of finding a way to produce something that other people can appreciate. And on that note, learn to love revision. Many writers lose interest once a story is complete, especially those who self-identify as pantsers, meaning that they write by the seat of their pants. That's fine if you're writing for fun, but if you're writing to sell, revision is your best friend. It's where you turn trash into treasure. It's where you take prose that's pretty good, and by killing your darlings, remove words that are just going to get in the way and bring it to a fine polish. It's like the difference between spray painting your new handy dandy coffee table and treating it with a nice French polish. We could spend the entire day talking about revision. I will just say, in general, you need to learn to revise in passes, where each pass you look for different specific things. Research that and you will not go wrong. Productivity is a skill. Anne Lamott tells us, actually, I think I have a slide for that. Yes, almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. Start by getting something, anything down on paper. What I've learned to do is sit down and work on a shitty first draft, is to quiet the voices in my head. It is far easier to fix what's down on paper in front of you than to sit there banging your head against the page or the screen. I cannot emphasize how important this is. And again, people are different. People have wildly varying opinions on the whole, pantser versus plotter approach in general and on revision specifically. But I think this is good advice. I think you need to get something down and then fix it. And if you fix it by completely rewriting it, or if you fix it by adjusting it, that's fine. Over time, the productivity will come if you work on it. And I'll use myself as an example. The first novel I attempted to write, I reckon I wrote about 340,000 words for what ended up being a 96,000 word novel that, had I self-published it, might have made some money, but I ultimately did not submit because I didn't think it was really ready for the market yet. I do not plan to spend my career writing 340,000 words for 96,000 words novels. The only way around that is to reduce the amount of redrafting and revision you do. And as with any skill, as you practice, you get better. I find now, having done this since like 2013 when I became a professional, I do edit a lot of things as I write the first draft. There are a lot of things where I am actually catching myself in my head as I write the words. I'm imagining people who have sent critique in the past, and I'm like, they may read this way. I don't really mean that. They may misunderstand this. I need to make that clear. One of the mistakes that I made when I was starting out is writing is hard. And it's tempting to hope that what you've written is good enough. Or put another way, writing is easy. Writing well enough anybody wants to read it is really, really hard. If you're hoping it's good enough, it's not. It's just not. Learning to tell is part of what you get through that 1,000,000 words of revision and accompanying critique. Learning to recognize what Dave Wolverton called a certain confidence that you see immediately when you start reading somebody's writing. Money. Money always flows to the writer. There are 1,000,000 scams aimed at writers. There may not be another field that is more rife with scams and tomfoolery and villainy. And the reason is because writers are desperate. Most of us are introverts. Most of us don't have, at least when we're starting out, we don't have a community of peers. We're sitting in our home or our coffee shop producing something that we hope will be a gem. But we don't have anybody to tell us, we don't have anybody to help us. And there are all these people offering, luring something we want. So how do you protect yourself from that? Well, number one, remember the rule that money always flows to the writer. Number two, remember what Mike told us and Martin alluded to earlier, which is that you don't work for free without a good reason. Now, I'm working for free today. I have a good reason. I have given my work for free. I appeared in the anthology Surviving Tomorrow with Neil Gaiman and A.C. Crispin and a whole lot of big names because it's good for my career to appear in that book. And also it was a good cause. I didn't have to think too much hard about that. But you do have to think about why you're working for free. And there are definitely companies that scam people into producing content for them. There are fake publishers that will get you to give away your rights. So read the fine print, be careful of what you are dealing with, and make use of resources like Writer Beware, which I'll have a link to on my website, and other blogs. Follow agents on Twitter so you can hear what they're talking about. Join writer groups. Well, we'll get to that. That's actually the next section. So let me two more topics on money, and then we'll get to that. Don't quit the day job, or at least have a backup. And I'll tell you a quick story. I went to Kevin J. Anderson's Superstars workshop, and I was talking to an old friend of mine I used to work with at SoftDisk back in the days before Doom and Quake. And he was telling me how he was one of these idiots, as he put it, who decided to be a writer, and he quit his job and he started writing. And I asked him, well, how'd that go? He said, well, I got a job again. I only made $13,000 that year. And there were 5 writers standing next to us who overheard this, and they came up and they said, you made $13,000? Don't quit the day job thinking you're going to be the next George R. R. Martin, or that you can pay for your mortgage. You might. I would recommend that you build up the writing career first. Which takes me to the last piece of advice I got when I went to the Writers of the Future conference, and this was from Tim Powers, who wrote On Stranger Tides, which was made into the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, and I think it's good advice if you can do it. Marry into wealth. A little late for me. If you can't do that, the next piece of advice is the first thing he told us at the workshop, which is look around whenever you're in a group of writers. And if you see them as competition, stop that. Other writers are your best friends. Okay, some of them may not be, but mostly, for the most part, they're your best friends. They can share opportunities. They can bring you into projects like this one. One of the things that Mike told me at Writers of the Future was to join my local Writers Guild. I had honestly never given it any thought. I'm not really a very social person. I live in a big city where it's logistically a pain in the neck to go anywhere other than work or the grocery store. But I joined the Writers Guild, and in part because I had run Writers of the Future, I was kind of an instant local celebrity. And because of that, the movers and shakers in the guild started inviting me to do things. And in that first year, I had maybe 10 or 12 appearances, in addition to the ones that the Writers of the Future folks arranged for us. I got a practical experience sitting on panels. I got an invite through a third party to a local convention. That led to me moderating panels. That has led to more of that kind of stuff. And this year, I've got an invite to submit content to Worldcon. So these kind of things, you never know where it's going to springboard. I also, the year after that, because the local writer guild was kind of desperate, they asked me to help edit an anthology, which is not something I had any interest in or had ever thought of doing. So I helped out. I kind of helped read the slush, helped edit the anthology, helped put it together. And as a result of that, later, when I realized, you know, one of the problems with new authors is we have nothing to sell if we do appearances. We don't have a bunch of novels like more established writers. So I got together with some of my Writers of the Future friends, and we published an anthology called The Future is Nigh, which was kind of a play on Writers of the Future, which was really not a very great title, but that gave us something to sell. And from that, I gained enough experience that a couple of years later, I decided to do a bigger anthology where I did all space stories, all award-winning authors. And I got an astronaut to write a foreword. And I got Spider Robinson to give me the rights to use a song that he'd written and had arranged by David Crosby of Crosby, Stills and Nash in my audiobook. So it pays to garner allies. It pays to be nice to people, learn from people. Opportunities grow like weeds if you foster the environment for them. And if you go back to that triad of professionalism, luck, and capability, this is how you grow the circle of luck. The more people you know, the more things you find out about, the more opportunities will come your way. How many minutes am I at, Martin?
You are at 34.
Okay, we're doing good. I've only got, I think, 3 more to go. Okay, rejectomancy. I already talked about the PR stuff. Rejectomancy is dumb. If you don't know what that is, there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time online thinking they know how to interpret the responses that they get from various editors. Why, when I send an editor, send a submission to this editor, if I get back this response, it means this. If I get back that, bull. It means nothing. I know enough of these editors. I've talked to them about it. In most cases, it means nothing. And so what if it did? If the editor wants you to know something, they will send you a personal rejection or an acceptance. If they don't send you a personal rejection, meaning they have something specific to say about you, you're not going to get anything actionable by guessing what it meant because they sent this form letter or that form letter, or they took this amount of time or that amount of time. When you submit something to market, keep track of it so that you can follow up in a reasonable period of time if you don't get a confirmation or a rejection or acceptance. But then move on, right? Next thing. That's what you need to be doing. It is not productive time to try to guess what is in other people's minds. Editors are like blind dates, except more fickle. They may love your story and not buy it because it's too similar to one they recently bought. I know because this has happened to me. They might just not like your style. I'm pretty sure that's happened to me. In fact, I know that's happened to me. It doesn't matter. You only need one editor who likes your particular story at a particular time to make a sale. And if you find an editor who likes your style, like I have with Trevor at Analog, then that's good. You can kind of build from there. But meanwhile, there are 1,000 other editors out there in the world, and don't rest on your laurels. So rejectomancy, not the best thing. Gatekeepers. By gatekeepers, we mean purchasing editors, agents, anybody who, I guess, gets in your way in the business. When I run Writers of the Future, I was appalled to find out, to find an online group of writers whose entire purpose for existing was to find ways around gatekeepers. They had it in their mind that the only reason they hadn't won or finaled in Writers of the Future was because, I don't know, the big bad people at their contest didn't see their brilliance. And if they could just network and find the right people who know the right people and know the right people, they could go around the slush pile and they could get published directly. I'm not even going to say I wish them luck, because boy, that's just not a good way to improve the standard of literature in the world. All these so-called gatekeepers exist for a purpose. They want to make money. They want you to make money. They want you to be a success. And if you send them something that they are the right person to sell, they are your best friend. They will make it happen. If you go around them just for the purpose of not going through that filter, the best you're going to accomplish is manage to get something published that you're going to end up being ashamed of later on in your life. Now, having said that, remember I said all writing advice is wrong. There are exceptions, right? I know a guy who writes stories about kind of obscure West Texas historical stuff. He's never going to have a large audience. He knows he's never going to have a large audience. He has a small audience that loves him, and he's happy with that. Great. For somebody like that, you go self-publish. It would be a waste of time for him to try to get some New York agent. That comes back to where you have to be honest with yourself about what you're trying to achieve with your career. If you're trying to reach a mass market, agents and publishers and purchasing editors who are in that genre or that area, yeah, they're gatekeepers because there are a lot of other people trying to do what you can do or what you're trying to do. And if you get past them in any way other than being better than the other people who are competing with you, that's at most a short-sighted and maybe a Pyrrhic, so what's that? A Pyrrhic victory. So gatekeepers are not always the way to success, but they are not the enemy. And that leads me to building a writing career is done one step at a time. Kevin J. Anderson he gives a little speech about, they're called the popcorn speech, in which he talks about putting work out into the world like popping popcorn. You pop one kernel at a time and you throw it up against the wall and eventually something will stick. Not sure how far I would take that metaphor, but I kind of see what he's saying. You know, he's saying don't throw out one work. And I know people who've done this. Write one novel and spend 30 years revising it, trying to get it to where it will sell. Oh, don't do that. Keep moving forward. But on the other hand, one famous author, and Martin can probably tell me if this was Bradbury or Heinlein, said, advise people to write a story a week for a year because no one can write 52 bad stories in a row. Anybody want to take a bet? I know I can. That'd be easy. But the point, again, is valid, right? Don't sit there stewing in your depression because you haven't gotten one rejection. Go on and write the next story. And maybe the next one will have a better idea. And it's the same thing for every other part. You know, one of the surprises that I've had in this business is that becoming a writer these days is not just becoming a writer. You have to become your own PR agent. It's helpful if you can be your own IT support. I have a newsletter that I support. I have a website that I support. I have a YouTube channel now that I put content into. I write science for Quora and a number of other publications. And I write and I do my own PR. And it can be overwhelming, right? But I started very, very simple. I started literally by going and sitting at a table at Comicpalooza and setting up a blog on Blogger. And then later I moved that to WordPress. And then later I moved that to my own hosted WordPress. And I had my newsletter on MailChimp because MailChimp is super crazy easy. And then I didn't want to pay money for a monthly account because it wasn't really making me any money at that point. So I moved that to something called Mautic, and I support that. So there are all these other tools, and and not even to talk about all the editing skills that I have. I'm now an artist again after giving that up when I went to high school or went to college. I know how to publish a book. I've published several books. But if I had sat down and tried to do all that back in 2013 or 2011, I'd have never gotten off the ground. So you don't have to worry about that. You know, a snowfall falls one flake at a time. And over time, the flakes build up. And if you assemble along the way, your career is the same way. And if you assemble the tools and the plans and the outlines and the alliances that you need, you can build great things. One flake at a time. So that's what you need to do with your career. Just avoid the pitfalls, keep climbing those stairs, and be remarkable. So, questions?
You got about 7 minutes for good questions. So let's hear from people. Feel free to unmute yourself or ask in the chat, either way.
I could think up 7 minutes worth of more things, but I don't have them written down, so I'll go in circles. One thing I did want to say that I missed in my notes, I had a slide that I skipped over, is about being your own PR manager. Most early career writers cannot afford like a PR manager or a what do you call it, an appearance coach or anything like that. But there are some things that I would advise. One is you do need a newsletter, but like start out with MailChimp. You do need a website, but it doesn't have to be anything sophisticated. It's not the worst idea in the world to have an email address that looks like a business instead of mydonkey23@gmail.com. But it doesn't have to be your own domain like mine is. Like mine is Stuart@cstuarthardwick.com. You don't have to do that, but if you can, that's great. But the big thing is, remember that everything you put online is part of your brand, for better or worse. So if you always wear your heart on your shirt sleeve, if you're always online whining, if you're always on your line demonizing one, political group or another, that is not necessarily the best way to present a brand if you're going for a mass market. On the other hand, it can be made to work for you. You can't please everyone all the time. I think somebody was going to say something.
We have a question, actually a number of them. Let me read them out to you from the chat.
Okay.
John K. Patterson, if you're working on multiple projects at the same time, what has worked in breaking them down and getting them all finished?
That is a good question that has come up before. I try to limit projects to 2 of the same general type at the same time. And that's just to kind of marshal my mental resources. So like I might be working on a YouTube video, but if I'm working on writing projects, I try to only have a limit of 2 at a time. But if one of those is a novel, I might write several short stories or science pieces while I'm working on the novels. So I would say the guiding, in my mind, the guiding principle there is to marshal your mental resources. Because if you're working on a novel, that takes a lot of mental energy to keep all the moving parts in the air. If you're working on a short story, it takes a lot less mental effort.
All right. Alex asks, I have been told to write 300 words a day, good or bad, just right. Thoughts?
If you are a beginner, that's not a bad advice. I will tell you, I do a lot of writing for Quora. Just a quick aside, one thing I forgot to mention is beware of building too much of a presence on any social media or cloud service that you're not paying for. As I did in the early days on something called SodaHead that you have never heard of because it doesn't exist anymore. And my 3,000 followers went poof in one day. That's why now I have a newsletter. But to your question, I have gotten a lot better writing fiction by writing for Quora. And the reason is because Quora is a lot of little short things, and they're not fiction, they're technical. And I was already a technical writer before I started writing fiction. But because they're so short and because the audience I'm writing for is so disparate, and I get feedback, and they used to have a feature where people could actually suggest revisions. But you get comments, and it's a really good way. You remember what I said before about building a model of how readers see your work? It has really helped me build a better model of how readers misinterpret things that I'm writing, which is great because I write science fiction. And sometimes I write complicated things in science fiction, and I don't want them to be misinterpreted. That'll throw people right out of the story. So I think that's good advice. However, everyone says you need to have a daily writing routine, and that is ideal. Realistically, not everybody can do that. So, whatever works for you, and don't think that you need to have one set goal for the rest of your career. When I was working on my last novel attempt, which got good marks back from the agent I ultimately hoped to get in New York, but did not sell, I had a goal of writing, I think my goal was 1,600 finished words a day, which is not, that's not enough really. But having a day job, it was sufficient, and I got it done in a reasonable period of time, and I didn't kill myself. So, 300 words a day is not unreasonable, and you can give yourself credit. Do 600 one day if you miss a day, that kind of thing.
All right. Stephen Satong asks, do you ever publish under a pseudonym, and why?
I do not. I would probably leave that up in the future to advice from an agent. I have writer friends who do that. Mostly the reason they do that is because they're in a different genre and they don't want to, it's for branding, right? There is another reason that I've been told, which is, if you write, for example, fantasy and sci-fi, especially if you write young adult fantasy and sci-fi, Sci-fi is a smaller market than fantasy. So if you publish something in fantasy and it's a pretty good success and it goes out into the bookstores and you have a certain sales, numbers come in, and then your next work is science fiction under the same name, it is possible that purchasers in the distribution system will look at that second book and say, man, this tanked compared to his or her previous work. This writer's career is stalling. So maybe I don't want to buy that book. I don't know how relevant that is today. I think that may be advice left over from the kind of earlier era before computers. My belief today is that you cannot escape yourself. You cannot hide. You cannot, your family is going to know what you wrote. Just don't worry about it. Just go for it and be who you are. But I could be wrong. Your mileage may vary on that one.
All right. We have a couple more questions, but we've hit our bio break. If you want to jump into the chat and respond there, that'd be good.
Okay.
Thank you, Stuart. This has been a mountain of good information, and I really appreciate your coming in. You did Mike proud.
Well, thank you, Martin, and thank you for putting this together.